Hi, and welcome to On My Shelf. Today I'm talking about a stunning middle grade novel in verse inspired by Ghanaian history about a boy who lives in a small African village and faces a harrowing journey into slavery. The Door of No Return by Kwame Alexander is the story of 11-year-old Kofi who lives in the African village of Upper Kwanta. He goes to school, spends time with his grandfather, and swims in the river often. But his family warns him not to go to the river at night. One night, he goes to the river, and his world is turned completely upside down. He's taken on a journey across unknown lands and sea, far away from everything he knows and loves. Kwame Alexander is also the author of the popular novels in verse The Crossover and Booked, as well as many others. He's won the Newbery Award and the Coretta Scott King Award for his novels. This book is the first in a trilogy, and let's just say I'm looking forward to the next books. There was so much to love about this book. The first one is poetry. It probably won't surprise you to know that I love novels in verse. Novels in verse allow authors to examine difficult topics, like a boy's capture into slavery and the deaths that happen in the story, in a way that allows some breathing room for the reader. Poetry can leave much open to interpretation. The reader brings as much to the story as the writer does. It's like a partnership. And I felt Alexander's poetry was spot on for this story, which isn't surprising, since he mostly writes in poetry and has many other novels in verse. I also really loved the exploration of a first crush. Even though this is a really serious book about a serious topic, a boy's journey into slavery, Alexander also showed the lighter side of adolescence before things started happening. Kofi is just like any other kid. He has his first crush, and he feels awkward around her. He deals with the teasing and the ribbing of the other kids. It all felt tragically realistic. He had a life from which he was taken. I also really loved the history. I enjoy books that examine history, and Alexander has a unique perspective for that history. These voices need to be heard. He writes about a boy who was taken from his family and sold into slavery, and those things happened, whether we like to acknowledge them or not. Kids need to know about them. History is important for kids to learn, because when we know our history, we know the mistakes we've made and we can learn from them. From a craft perspective, I really enjoyed, surprise, the poetry. I know I've already talked about this part, but I'm a big fan of Alexander, and it's worth saying that his poetry is practically perfect. His dialogue felt easy to follow, and the chapter titles sometimes led into poems, and sometimes they stood alone. So this kept me reading a little more closely instead of just racing through the pages. Poetry also lends itself to short chapters, and that made the pages fly. My 8-year-old read the book in 2 days. He was so excited about this. I also really enjoyed the character development. As I mentioned before, Kofi was portrayed in a way that felt very timeless, although he was living in a historical time. His friends teased each other. He tried to avoid his cousin, who bullied him a little. He had his first crush. These are all things that 11-year-olds and 12-year-olds experience today. So even though he was writing a character who lived hundreds of years before kids today, they can still identify with him. That's something we always want to do in historical fiction. Otherwise, we lose kids. And I really enjoyed the story within a story. In different sections of The Door of No Return, Alexander used a craft device of story within story. They almost had the feel of legends. They broke up the narrative and gave the reader an opportunity to digest what had happened to Kofi after each section, which allowed readers to wonder what would happen next. I love these kinds of asides. So here's what we can take away from The Door of No Return. Number 1, use more poetry. I write novels in verse too, and my book, The First Magnificent Summer, is written in prose, but it also includes poetry. But I was reminded reading The Door of No Return to find places where I can use more poetry. And poetry doesn't just have to look like poems. Sometimes it's just the poetry of language. Or it can be poetry in structure, like using short sections for scenes instead of long, drawn-out ones. I actually really enjoy writing this way, and I think readers appreciate it because there's always an easy place for them to stop. It helps them savor stories instead of feeling like they're tedious. So, Insert more poetry into stories wherever it makes sense. Number 2, consider including stories within a story. I mentioned that I love these kinds of stories, which made me wonder why I don't use the craft device more often. It's something we do in our lives, too. We're living a story, and we tell stories inside it. I do this with my children at the dinner table. Alexander's technique in The Door of No Return made me want to embrace more of that in my own writing. I want to look for more ways to use stories within my stories and break up the narrative a bit, not in ways that feel unnatural, but in ways that make sense and flow with the story itself. Number 3, embrace strong willed characters who own their stories. Kofi was a strong 11-year-old kid. You have to grow up fast when you're taken from your family, so it makes sense. And there were times when he felt like he was ready to give up, but he never did. He recognized his power and that the slave traders could never take that away from him. It reminds me that when we feel at our most helpless, we still have power. We may not have power over other people, but we definitely have power over our own actions and our attitudes. The same is true for our characters. They are not victims of their circumstances. They may have to live in and with those circumstances, but they still own their power. Thanks for the reminder, Kwame. That's it for today's On My Shelf. If you're interested in hearing an author's perspective on books, movies, and sometimes TV shows, be sure to subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.